Bonjour à tous and welcome to another video. Today we're going to be talking about the prefixes re, re and are. Now on the face of it this is very simple. You take a verb, add one of these prefixes and it means do that verb again. For example, refaire is to redo. Relire is to reread or to proofread. And réessayer is to try again or to retry. The problem is that sometimes these prefixes change the meaning of a word in a way that maybe we don't expect, or it changes the meaning completely. So in this video I'm going to talk about 5 verbs whose meaning changes with the addition of one of these prefixes. I've chosen these 5 because they're relatively common and their meanings are quite varied. If you'd like me to do a second part to this video, then I'm perfectly happy to do that, especially if you have particular verbs that you would like me to talk about. Before we start though, the one question I need to answer is, how do we know whether to add re, re or just an are? In most cases we just add re, are, e. So for example we have remonter, remettre and reposer. If, however, the verb begins with a vowel, we'll either add re or just an are, and unfortunately there are no rules for this one, so you kind of just have to learn them as they come. So for example, as we've already seen, essayer becomes réessayer, but emballer, meaning to wrap something up, becomes remballer, to wrap something back up. Agir, meaning to act, becomes réagir, to react, but ouvrir, meaning to open, becomes rouvrir, meaning to reopen. So the first verb I want to talk about is retrouver. Retrouver, which is trouver, meaning to find, with re in front of it, so it's to re-find or to find again. But this one doesn't necessarily mean that you've lost something before and found it and now you're finding it again. Instead, it means that you're finding something that you have previously had. So for example, you could say, j'ai trouvé les clés. J'ai trouvé les clés. I have found the keys. But this implies that you've never had those keys before. This is the first time you've ever seen them. So for example, say you stay at an Airbnb and the host has left the keys outside for you, you can say j'ai trouvé les clés because this is the first time you've ever seen those keys. If, however, you're talking about keys that you've had previously, have since lost and then found, you can use retrouver. J'ai retrouvé les clés. Or indeed, j'ai retrouvé mes clés. I found my keys. Now that doesn't mean that you're going to cause immense confusion by saying j'ai trouvé mes clés. People aren't going to assume that you've never seen your keys before, but you will find that French speakers will speak in this slightly more precise way. So remember that retrouver is about finding something that you have previously had, not necessarily finding something that you have previously found. But that's not all for retrouver, because it can also mean to meet up with someone. And if you think about it, this kind of makes sense. You're finding people that you've found before, i.e. your friends. So for example, you could say, je vais retrouver mes amis au parc. Je vais retrouver mes amis au parc. I'm going to meet up with my friends at the park. I wouldn't think too much about this one. You don't have to think of it as re plus trouver. Just remember that retrouver means to meet up. I would also like to talk about the difference between se trouver and se retrouver because they are also slightly different. Se trouver means to be located, to be situated. For example, la Tour Eiffel se trouve à Paris. La Tour Eiffel se trouve à Paris. The Eiffel Tower is in Paris. It's situated in Paris. Se retrouver, on the other hand, means to end up somewhere, to find yourself somewhere without really meaning to be there. So for example, il s'est retrouvé à Paris. Il s'est retrouvé à Paris would be he found himself in Paris. He ended up in Paris. He didn't exactly mean to, but he was there. The difficulty with this one is that se retrouver can also mean to meet up with each other. So in the plural, ils se sont retrouvés à Paris. Ils se sont retrouvés à Paris could mean they ended up in Paris or they met each other in Paris. Remember, context is key. Next, we have the verb rajouter. Rajouter, which is the prefix are plus ajouter, meaning to add. So this literally means to re-add, although it's not really a word we use in English. So ajouter without the are means to add something which isn't already there. So for example, you could say, ce thé n'est pas assez sucré, je vais ajouter du sucre. Ce thé n'est pas assez sucré, je vais ajouter du sucre. This tea isn't sweet enough, I'm going to add some sugar, the implication being that there isn't any sugar in it already. If, however, you said ce thé n'est pas assez sucré, je vais rajouter du sucre, ce thé n'est pas assez sucré, je vais rajouter du sucre, it means this tea isn't sweet enough, I'm going to add more sugar, the implication being that there is sugar in there already, but you want more. So rather than thinking of rajouter as re-add, I think it's more helpful to think of it as to add more. Sticking with the theme of hot drinks, we could say il n'y a pas de lait dans ce café, je vais en ajouter. Il n'y a pas de lait dans ce café, je vais en ajouter. There isn't any milk in this coffee, I'm going to add some. If, on the other hand, there is milk in the coffee but you want to add more, we would say je vais en rajouter. For example, il y a très peu de lait dans ce café, je vais en rajouter. Il y a très peu de lait dans ce café, je vais en rajouter. There's very little milk in this coffee, I'm going to add some more. We also have the expression en rajouter, which means to exaggerate. So for example, you could say, n'en rajoute pas. N'en rajoute pas, don't exaggerate. Or similarly, arrête d'en rajouter. Arrête d'en rajouter, stop exaggerating. Of course, you could just use the verb exagérer, meaning to exaggerate, but en rajouter is quite a nice expression. Next, we have renvoyer, which is the prefix R plus envoyer, meaning to send. So literally this means to resend. And of course, in some cases, it can mean exactly that. For example, je t'ai renvoyé le message. Je t'ai renvoyé le message would be I resent you the message, or I sent the message to you again. But renvoyer also has a few other meanings which are related but very slightly different. For example, it can mean to fire someone. For example, Paul s'est fait renvoyer hier. Paul s'est fait renvoyer hier. Paul was fired yesterday. Similarly, it can mean to expel or to exclude. For example, la directrice est super stricte. Elle a renvoyé 3 élèves hier. La directrice est super stricte. Elle a renvoyé 3 élèves hier. The headmistress is really strict. She expelled 3 students yesterday. It can also mean to send something or someone back. For example, les immigrés ont été renvoyés dans leur pays d'origine. Les immigrés ont été renvoyés dans leur pays d'origine. The immigrants were sent back to their home countries. And on top of all of that, renvoyer is one of the many different ways that we can say to postpone something. For example, le patron a renvoyé la réunion à demain. Le patron a renvoyé la réunion à demain. The boss postponed the meeting to tomorrow. The next verb I want to talk about is rentrer. Rentrer, which is entrer, meaning to enter, with an R in front of it. So of course it means re-enter. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this one. And indeed it does mean to re-enter or to go back in. For example, je suis rentré dans le magasin pour acheter du chocolat. Je suis rentré dans le magasin pour acheter du chocolat. I went back into the shop to buy some chocolate. But as well as re-enter, it can also mean to go back. Usually to a place that you came from rather than just a place that you have been to. So, for example, we have the expression rentrer à la maison. Rentrer à la maison, to go home. Or rentrer chez soi. Rentrer chez soi, which means the same thing. For example, elle est rentrée chez elle à 1h du matin. Elle est rentrée chez elle à 1h du matin. She went back home at 1 o'clock in the morning. Or you could say, elle est rentrée à la maison à 1h du matin. Elle est rentrée à la maison à 1h du matin. That means the same thing. Similar to that, students rentrent à l'école. Let's go back to school. So for example, you could say, les élèves rentrent à l'école en septembre. Les élèves rentrent à l'école en septembre. The children go back to school in September. In fact, the day that you go back to school in French is called la rentrée. La rentrée. We then have a couple of other uses which don't seem to match any of that at all. For example, rentrer can be used to crash into something. For example, la voiture est rentrée dans un mur. La voiture est rentrée dans un mur. The car crashed into a wall. And we also have the expression rentrer dans un budget. rentrer dans un budget, to fit in or be within a budget. For example, ce prix ne rentre pas dans le budget. Ce prix ne rentre pas dans le budget. This price isn't within the budget, it doesn't fit this budget. So these last two are kind of just cases that are useful to remember. Thinking about why we use rentrer in that case is really not worth it. Just remember that rentrer can mean to crash into something, and it can also mean to fit within a budget. Last but not least, we have the verb relever. Relever, which is re plus lever, meaning to lift, so to relift. And as weird as that sounds, it basically just means to pick something back up. For example, you could say, j'ai relevé les bouteilles que j'avais renversées. J'ai relevé les bouteilles que j'avais renversées. I picked up the bottles that I had knocked over. And what this example shows is that these prefixes aren't always about doing something for a second time. If I say j'ai relevé les bouteilles, it doesn't mean that I'm picking them up again, it means that I'm putting them back into their original state. And that kind of helps us to explain why we have the expression relever la tête, which either literally means to lift your head up or figuratively to get back up again. It's not about lifting your head up for a second, third or fourth time, it's about bringing it back to its usual state. So instead of thinking of this as relift, think of it as lift back up. Relever can also mean something like to take note of or to pick up on. For example, le professeur a relevé quelques erreurs dans le texte. Le professeur a relevé quelques erreurs dans le texte. The teacher found or picked up on a few errors in the text. We also have relever de quelque chose, which means to fall into a certain category or to be part of a certain group. For example, ce mot relève du langage parlé. Ce mot relève du langage parlé. This word comes from the spoken language. It's part of the spoken language. You could also say ça relève du bon sens. Ça relève du bon sens, meaning that comes from common sense. That's just part of people's common sense. And in a slightly more negative vein, you could say ça ne relève pas de mes compétences. Ça ne relève pas de mes compétences. That's not one of my skills. That doesn't fall within my capabilities. So as you can see, sometimes adding this prefix does just mean to do something again. And in fact, you can make these up. For example, re-regarder clearly means to watch something again or to re-watch, even though I doubt that you would find the word in a dictionary. However, you do have to be careful because sometimes, as we have seen, the meaning changes quite dramatically. So I wouldn't just randomly create new verbs as you wish. It's always a good idea to check. And there we go. Thank you very much for watching this video. If, of course, you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Also, like I said at the start, if you would like me to do a second part to this video, I'm perfectly happy to do that. Do by all means put your suggestions in the comments. Thank you very much again, and until next time, à bientôt.